Okay, where are we? So the nugget number one, I just want to remind everyone, nugget number one was, how structured should a speech be? And my answer is very. Nugget number two was, what role does anxiety play and what do you do about it? Paul, have you got a question for me?
I do. So you speak about the chosen one.
Yeah.
What is that?
So I mentioned when I spoke about the sandwich, the fact that we want a meaty speech, and the meat is the middle bit. And my feeling is that there should only be one message inside that meaty bit, one main message. And the main message should be geared towards having your audience understand very, very quickly what they need to do, think, or feel. And don't ask them to do more than one thing, or think more than one thing, or feel more than one thing. It's just the one thing per speech.
Is that because they're only going to remember one message really after your speech, one central message?
Yes and no, but it's also because there are things going on in their lives other than your speech. And so, yes, they'll remember one thing more easily than five, but also you then have an opportunity to seed it multiple times. So it's much more stronger than it would be if it was one of five diluted messages. And it's the same rule for those of you who write social media content. At the end of a post, don't ask people to like, share, and comment and click the link. It must just be one. So it's either like, share, or comment, or click the link, but don't give two, because then they won't do anything. So exactly the same with the meaty part of your speech. Based on your strategy, what you want them to think, do, or feel, you want to structure everything around the one message. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you are giving a speech at work and you are in your speech honoring an exiting leader. So let's say the chairman is retiring and you're giving his farewell speech. Now, your strategy or your purpose is that you want your audience to feel moved or inspired or enthusiastic or some combination of those. You want them to feel things in their heart, right? And in order to do that, you need an analogy. So I don't want to talk too much about boats and ships. That seems to be a weird theme that's coming now. Boats, ships, sea, scuba diving. I don't know where that came from. But if we talk about the captain of an airplane, and we use that metaphor to describe the exiting chair, and you make sure that your one main message is that this guy is like the captain of an airplane, then what happens is your metaphor or your analogy give a beautiful sense of structure to the whole speech. And you can weave in anecdotes that relate or don't relate to the captaincy or the plane. But the one main message is that this guy led the company fearlessly and bravely from the front, for example. And that's your main message. And if you keep coming back to that, it becomes a very simple but very powerful message that is reiterated. So again, another example from a speech I heard recently. I don't know if the speaker is here, but Brian, if you are here, this is for you. Brian gave a very, very nice speech in which he used a dartboard as his metaphor. And what I liked about it was that the story he told about the dartboard was so simple, and yet it had so many legs moving through the narrative to his point at the end. And the simpler the metaphor, often the better the speech.
But I love what you've just said now, because whether it's a business presentation or a speech, if you can keep the message really simple and not overcomplicated, people will just simply remember it better. So instead of being on this mission to show people how clever we are with complicated stuff, the simpler the metaphor, the better it is. Yeah,
absolutely. Again, I'm putting a star in my notebook here, because here's Brian. He's just joined us, and it's his speech that I was speaking about. Brian, you missed the part where I spoke about you. I'm highlighting this again. I need to try not to show my audience how clever I am all the time. If they don't need to know that, I must just say the thing once. Yes, well, thanks, Paul. You know, but I don't need to prove that I'm clever and funny and witty and entertaining. I must just get on with it, you know. So I'm highlighting, don't be too clever. Right, good. And then I have some questions for you. I've wanted to ask you these questions for a long time, and they relate, you're not going to be surprised, but they relate to the two things that make me most anxious when I speak. When I speak, either in front of an audience on stage or virtually, how important is the gesturing and the body positioning? Because as those of you in our current audience may have noticed, I cannot speak without my hands, and I can't control what to do.
Good.
So you've told me that I must carry on doing that, but where do you put your body in space? Like, does it matter which foot is in front?
Not really. So let's just put this into perspective. Up until a few years ago, when we talked about speaking in front of an audience, we were standing in person in front of the audience and they could see your entire body. Now that we're online, a lot of us are sitting in front of our computers, and some of us with fancy studios might be standing in front of our camera. In that case, it's a little bit more like doing a person in person. But let's just look at the screen for now. Okay. So the first thing is you want to try and position yourself in such a way, and you don't have to really be right in the middle. It's not critical, but it is nice to be in the middle. And if you do what I do every now and then, like for instance, you stick up, let me just find it. Let's say you put up an overlay, as I did earlier on, like this. Okay, so then you want to be a little bit to the one side so that your overlay can come up. That's absolutely fine. But the rest of the time, you want to be in picture so that people can see your hands. Now, why is that? Well, it's quite simple. You can't be bobbing around like that and moving your head. You shouldn't really be moving your shoulders too much. And generally speaking, if you're online, you're going to be fairly static. If they've got a full picture of you with your feet and what have you, yes, you can move, but you don't want to move out of camera. And the rule generally is if you're going to move, it must be slow and deliberate. And the same really with hands. Now, let's just go to face-to-face where you're on stage in front of an audience and they can see your entire body. Ideally, especially if you've got slides, if you move around too much, you move away from your monitor so you can't see your slides. So you end up in no man's land. You don't want to do that. So you need to plan it up front where you're going to stand. And in fact, you can actually mark out in tape the area on your stage where you can stand so that you can still see your monitor. Let's say you're not using slides, then it's not an issue. Then you can walk up and down, but not like a caged tiger. Nice and slow and deliberate so that you look as if you're in charge. But ultimately, your most powerful position is standing with both feet on the ground, not leaning on one leg or the other, or moving backwards and forwards. You're standing with both feet on the ground, preferably shoulder length apart. Your head is relatively still. And the two things that you're going to be using in order to show movement are your gestures, as I'm doing right now, and your facial expressions. And the remarkable thing with facial expressions is that we can identify all kinds of things by looking at someone's face. The closer they are, the more that we can see. So when you make a statement like, you look tired when you're close to somebody, how did you work that one out? I mean, it's not as if they were sitting there like that or something. It was very, very subtle. So we pick up these nuances on the face. And the second thing is that when we use gestures to describe a story, firstly, it gives tremendous energy to the speech. But secondly, gestures mean something. And I'll give you a few very simple examples. So if I were to do this, you know that it doesn't mean go away. It means the opposite. It means come here. And if you do it with a finger, it's a lot more aggressive. So it adds a different dimension to the same kind of message. Now, if I were to lean forward and do this, okay, you know that means be quiet. But if I did it and I said, shh, it's even more powerful because I've added some sound to it. So gestures are incredibly powerful in terms of getting a message across. And if anyone has animals, and you'll see how they often ignore your verbal instructions, but when you indicate to them, in other words, if you said sit and they didn't want to sit, but you took your finger and you went like this, the dog will sit. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're dogs. All I'm saying is that mammals do respond to gestures, and gestures are incredibly powerful. The only thing you want to be a little bit careful of is if you're speaking to audiences in other countries, that you don't pick on a gesture that might offend them. And I've spoken in a few other countries. One in particular, in 2009, I went to Iran and did a few speeches there. And I found out that this does not mean what it does in the rest of the world. I'll leave it to your imagination. But that generally means fantastic or bakhat or shap or whatever. But in Iran, it does not mean that. It means something completely different. So I'm going to encourage you. I'm going to encourage you to use gestures. And if
not this one.
Well, you can, provided you're not in Iran. But if you want to see how powerful gestures really are, then go to the local Spur at 6:30 on a Friday evening or a Saturday evening, if it suits you better, and just watch the families interacting. And you'll find that the person that is telling the story is using natural gestures, and that helps to bring the story across. And if I can just give you one other important thing, miming can be a great thing to do when you are doing a speech. In other words, pretending that you're using something. So for instance, I might pretend that I'm throwing a ball. So I will, and this is very important, you can't just have the ball. You've got to pick up the ball. So you pick up the ball, and now you're pretending that you're throwing it to somebody and they catch it, and then they throw it back to you and you then catch it again. But when you're finished with your little anecdote about the ball can't just disappear into thin air. You must put the ball down again. Otherwise, you're going to freak out about 30% of your audience that are going to wonder where the ball's gone. So gestures are important. They add great impetus to your speech. And I've heard people say, oh, well, when I looked at the video, I gestured too much. You cannot gesture too much unless you're Italian. And even so, I love watching Italians speak because they gesture too much. And it's fantastic because they have this wonderful, wonderful energy.
I love that. I love the tennis ball analogy. So you've got to actually believe that it's real so that your audience believes that it's real and so that you make them feel safe.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Sounds awesome.